I wanted to make this video like 2 weeks ago. In fact, I put up a post on the YouTube channel saying that this was coming a couple weeks ago, and I just never got to it. And the reason I never got to it is because I wrote multiple scripts for this video trying to think through how to best word what I wanted to say. I think I finally figured out how to do that. I'm still working on figuring out this YouTube thing and how I want to do it and how to best present the topics that I want to talk about. And so I think I've landed on how I want to talk about this topic. So I want to talk about end time interpretations or interpretations of New Testament prophecy and why I left behind a futurist slash dispensational understanding of the prophecies in the New Testament, specifically found in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, 25, and Mark chapter 13, and the book of Revelation. And so I want to talk about what convinced me to move away from, again, a futurist or a dispensational understanding of the prophecies found in those sections of Scripture to a partial preterist understanding of those passages of Scripture. But before I do that, let me just define some terms really quick so that way we're clear on what we're even talking about. So when I say futurist interpretation of New Testament prophecy, what I'm talking about is a approach to the text that is interpreting those passages, those prophecies in the New Testament as something that is going to happen in the distant future. So seeing things like think of Revelation and the bowl judgments and the scroll judgments and things like that, interpreting those as being something that is still in our future even now. That would be a futurist interpretation. It's a very kind of general definition of it, so don't judge me too hard if you wanted something more detailed. So that's what futurism or futurist interpretation is. Dispensationalism is the futurist interpretation version of a futurist interpretation that I grew up in and that I believed all the way through college. And basically it interprets the Bible, and this is really the most common view about the end times and about New Testament prophecy that you'll find amongst evangelicals in America today. It's a way of understanding New Testament prophecy that basically sees there being a rapture of the church followed by a 7-year tribulation, then the second coming of Christ with a 1,000-year millennial reign after that. That's a literal 1,000-year millennial reign, along with another tenet of that belief system being that the church and Israel are two separate peoples of God. And so that's what I grew up believing in. And what I want to talk about this video, and I think I've said this like 3 times now, but what I want to talk about is why I left behind that understanding of New Testament prophecy for partial preterism. Now, what is partial preterism? Last definition that I want to give to kind of just give us a firm foundation of terms here before we go into the discussion. Partial preterism is a way of interpreting New Testament prophecy, specifically the Olivet Discourse and parts of the book of Revelation, as having happened in the first century, specifically with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There's another version of preterism called full preterism, which sees really all New Testament prophecies as having been fulfilled in the first century, including the return of Christ and the resurrection. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians and in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians rebukes that view. That's a heretical view. That's not what partial or moderate preterism is. Moderate preterism or partial preterism sees the return of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, the judgment as all still being future events that we're waiting on. The return of Christ is yet to happen within partial preterism, but other things like what is talked about in the Olivet Discourse, think Matthew 24, Matthew 25, Mark chapter 13, has happened in the first century, really culminating in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So what I want to talk about, 3 reasons why I became convinced of partial preterism, moved away from a dispensational futurist understanding of those parts of Scripture, and really just why I found the partial preterist viewpoint so convincing. But before that, I just kind of want to add this note. I think that this is an important and worthy video to be made, because if you were like me, whenever I was wading through all this information, I had become very disenfranchised, very discouraged, and troubled by a dispensational understanding of those passages and some of the fruit that I was seeing, especially living in the Bible Belt, that came from dispensationalism. Specifically, my kind of understanding of these passages began in 2020. I was co-preaching through with some other pastors the book of Revelation during 2020, and I would get to my week to preach and get to studying the passage that I was assigned, and we all had at that time a premillennial dispensational understanding, and so I would go to study the passage and know that I'm supposed to arrive at a premillennial dispensational interpretation, but as I studied, I just couldn't get there, and so kind of began to question, like, man, is this view actually right? Does this actually get Scripture correctly? And just began to struggle with it really through the whole time that we preached through that book. Began to question more and more. After that, I began to look at historic premillennialism, which is a different version of premillennialism, an older version of premillennialism that goes back to the early church, and explored that a little bit. Really wasn't satisfied with how that view handled Scripture either, and so I ended up with coming to the partial preterist amillennial understanding of those passages. But another thing that kind of moved me to begin to move away from a dispensational understanding of those passages was, as I mentioned, some of the fruit that I was seeing, especially in 2020, where especially in the Bible Belt amongst Christians, and I'm not saying this is indicative or true of all dispensationalists, but I saw it a lot. People kind of being like, oh, the COVID vaccine is the mark of the beast, or everything that's going on with the quarantines is the government preparing to set up a one world government so the Antichrist can take over. And so I saw a lot of fear mongering, a lot of newspaper theology, as Grant Osborne calls it, and a lot of speculation that, for me, I struggled with, because I didn't see that in the text, but also on a pastoral level I was struggling with, because I was seeing in congregants and in Christians that I knew that it was causing a lot of anxiety, and just not good fruit was coming from some of those abuses of dispensationalism. Again, not saying that that's true of all dispensationalists, but you see a lot of those abuses come from that system, and it leads to bad fruit, leads to anxiety, and even for some people maybe even leads to questioning and deconstructing a little bit. And so I think that this video and this topic is worth exploring because of that. If you're like me, if you're like me, or were like what I was like at that time, and you're questioning and you're seeing what's going on in the news cycle right now with the war in Israel and all that, and you see Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz talking about like the Bible and Israel, and whether or not the Bible commands that we have to support Israel and go to war and bomb Iran and things like that. If you're seeing that in the news and you're like, man, I don't know if that's right, that doesn't feel right to me, that doesn't seem like what Scripture says, this video hopefully will help you, hopefully give you a little bit of guidance on how to think through this, and maybe give you a different option for approaching these passages in Scripture. So 3 reasons why I left behind a dispensational understanding of the end times of New Testament prophecy. And the first reason is really the context of the Olivet Discourse. Shortly after preaching through Revelation in 2020, I began to preach through the Gospel of Mark. Eventually, I wound up in Mark chapter 13, which is Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse. And I was just struck by how strongly the context of the Olivet Discourse limits exegetically, that means interpretively, how you can take the following verses, or really the whole of the prophecy that Jesus gives in the Olivet Discourse. So let me just read to you. I've got it here in front of me. Mark chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. It says this, "And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings.' And Jesus said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.' And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us when these things, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Now, if we stop right there and we're being good exegetes and we're approaching this text and letting the text tell us what it's talking about, it's very clear that the topic of discussion for the Olivet Discourse is the destruction of the temple. And it really would not make any sense to take the Olivet Discourse in any way other than it being a conversation about the destruction of the temple. And again, I'm not trying to be triumphalist or anything like that in this video. I'm really just trying to give a very lay level, simple explanation of like, hey, these were the things that just convince me that dispensationalism or futurist interpretation generally doesn't really work exegetically. The context of the Olivet Discourse is just so convincing and so restricting for how we can take the rest of the Olivet Discourse. I mean, Jesus, he's walking out of the temple. He points to the stones as the disciples are marveling at them. And he says, hey, I'm going to tear this down. Not a single stone is going to be left standing. And then the disciples in verse 3 verse 3 and 4, ask a direct question to his statement about destroying the temple. Jesus, when is this going to happen? What are the signs that this is about to happen? And then Jesus goes into the teaching of the Olivet Discourse and just unpacks and answers the question that they asked, which was a direct response to him saying the temple is going to be destroyed. And so taking the Olivet Discourse as referring to something in the future that is yet to happen exegetically doesn't make any sense, because the context limits us to interpreting the passage as a discussion about the temple. So, for example, let me read this. This is Mark chapter 13, starting in verse 6. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. So, right there, that verse, wars and rumors of wars. If you grew up in the Bible Belt, you've heard that be quoted as things happen in the news to say, oh, we're getting close to the return of Christ. But that's part of Jesus' answer to their question, what are the signs that the temple is about to be destroyed? It's very clearly limited by the context of the passage. Even in these past few weeks, right, there's been wars or rumors of wars. There's that earthquake off the coast of Russia. And again, I see and I hear, look at social media, speculation, reels, TikToks of people saying, oh my goodness, there's wars in Russia, there's wars in Israel, there's earthquakes off the coast of Russia, the return of Christ is soon. But that's just not what Jesus is talking about here. He's answering a direct question from his disciples. What are the signs that the temple is about to be destroyed? If you look at church history, you look at history written about the first century, all these things happened leading up to the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD. Famines, wars, earthquakes recorded as happening before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It's very, very, very likely that that's what Jesus is talking about and prophesying about here in the Olivet Discourse. So that's the first reason that I became convinced that dispensational futurist interpretation of the prophecies in the New Testament, specifically the Olivet Discourse, weren't right, and that there had to be something else, and that a partial preterist understanding of these passages made more sense. Here's the second reason that I became convinced of partial preterism, and we find this also in Mark chapter 13. You can find this in the other versions of the Olivet Discourse, and for example, Luke and Matthew's Gospel. But this is Mark chapter 13, verse 30. I'm using Mark because I'm most familiar with Mark as I preached through it not too long ago. So Mark chapter 13, verse 30, he gives this statement, and I'll read back just a little bit to give some context. He says in verse 28, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates." So, again, a direct response to the disciples' question, which was a direct response to Jesus saying the temple was going to be destroyed. What are the signs that these are things are going to take place? He uses a fig tree as an example. When you see the branches become tender, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these signs taking place, you know that this event is coming close. And then he says this in verse 30, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So he's looking at the disciples and he says, this generation, you who are standing in front of me right now, you're not going to die until everything that I just talked about takes place, until everything that I just talked about happens and comes to pass. He's saying these things that I've talked about, the rumors of wars, the earthquakes, the famines, all of this is going to happen before you die. John, Andrew, James, Peter. He's referring to them. Now, a futurist dispensational understanding of the Olivet Discourse will look at this verse and typically say something along the lines of, he's talking about a future or an eschatological generation, but that's just not how the word is used in the Gospels. I believe there's 28 uses of the word generation. I might be off by a couple there. About 28 uses of the word generation in the Gospels. Every single time that it's used, Jesus is referring to the people standing right in front of him. So for instance, there's that moment in the Gospels where the Pharisees are demanding a sign from Jesus. And he says, no, you're not going to be given any sign except the sign of Jonah. And he says that a wicked and adulterous generation demands a sign. And he's talking about them. He's calling them a wicked and adulterous generation that demands a sign. And so the way Jesus uses this word generation always in the Gospels is used to refer to those living right now in front of him. And so it wouldn't make sense to interpret that word that way in every other use of the word, but then when we get to the Olivet Discourse say, nah, it means something else. Nah, it's referring to a future generation that has not yet come. And so what's more likely is that he just means what he says here. This generation, my disciples, those living right now, they're not going to die until everything that I just talked about comes to pass. We're not waiting till 2,000 years in the future for, Bill in America for these things to happen. No, we're talking about things happening right now in the first century with the destruction of the temple. Another thing that's worth noting is that the word generation in biblical theology, that means the unfolding of Scripture, is typically used to refer to 40 years or a generation of 40 years. So think about the Israelites wandering around in the desert for 40 years, the wilderness generation as they're called. They wander in the desert for 40 years. And so you have that weight also attached to the word generation. And so when you think about it in those terms, Jesus is delivering the Olivet Discourse likely in 30 AD or around there, 40 years from 30 AD, 70 AD, which is when the temple was destroyed. And so when you look at all that evidence as far as how the word generation is used in the gospel, how it's used in the Gospels, how it's used in the scope of biblical theology, it becomes very apparent Jesus is talking about those who are alive at that time, and he's saying everything that I've just talked about is going to come to pass while you're alive. And so that really convinced me that we're not talking about some future thing that's going to come. We're talking about things that happen, events that happen in the first century that Jesus accurately prophesied and predicted some 40 years prior, which is incredible. What a apologetic, what a testimony to the truthfulness of Christianity. That gives me confidence as a believer. And so that's the second reason that I became convinced that a futurist or a dispensational understanding of these passages didn't quite get the text right, and that partial preterism, and specifically an amillennial partial preterist understanding of the text, is more accurate. The third reason that I became convinced is really because of church history. And obviously I don't give as much weight to an argument from church history as I would to an argument from Scripture, which is why I started with Scripture. But when you look at church history, dispensationalism is a new view. It's a new view. Dispensationalism really came into being in the 1900s under the ministry and work of a man named John Nelson Darby. Prior to 200 years ago, a dispensational understanding of New Testament prophecy in the Bible generally, and of the end times cannot be found in church history for 1,800 years. 1,800 years, you're not seeing a rapture that comes before 7-year tribulation at all, really, in the history of the church. It's a new view. It's a novel view. And so for me, being someone who enjoys and loves church history and puts weight into the history of the church and puts weight into gleaning wisdom from the minds of those who came before us, who were in many cases geniuses, I struggle to look at a view that goes against the grain of 1,800 years of church history and say, no, that new view is right. No, Calvin, Luther, Augustine, all these guys, they had it wrong for all that time. We didn't get it right until just 200 years ago. I struggle to do that because that, to me, does not feel humble. It doesn't feel like we're wanting to sit under and learn from those who came before us. And I'm not saying that to be a dispensationalist is to be prideful or anything like that. I'm just saying, for me personally, I want to subject myself to the wisdom that came before and not, say, oh no, we've had it wrong this whole time, now we have it right. I think that's a dangerous point of view, a dangerous way to approach the text. And so that reality, discovering, hey, this is a new view, this came into being just recently, and for the majority of church history, people have been amillennial in their understanding of eschatology and the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Learning that really helped me move away from dispensationalism to amillennialism specifically, but also, as I've already mentioned, a partial preterist understanding of these passages. Really, we could say it like this, like the church history part helped me move to amillennialism and helped me see that better, and the Olivet Discourse specifically helped me move away from a futurist interpretation to a partial preterist interpretation, just because I found it so convincing. So really, those three things together just convinced me that, man, a futurist dispensational interpretation, specifically the Olivet Discourse, is just really not exegetically possible. Not if we're going to just take the text as it is in its context. I'm not saying there's not good arguments. I'm not saying there's not good interpretations from my dispensational brethren, but the weight of even just those 2 points that I gave from Mark 13 are just so convincing. Talking about the temple, that's the context of the passage. Jesus says, hey, you're not going to pass away until these things happen. And then not to mention, this is a new view. It's not been around for the majority of church history. Amillennialism has been the predominant view for all of this time. And so I'm just hesitant to go against 1,800 years of church history. Really, amillennialism started with Augustine in the 4th and 5th century. And so it's not, amillennialism doesn't go back all the way, but still for the majority of church history, amillennialism was the predominant view. And I find that very convincing on a historical level, as well as textual and exegetical levels. But my defense here really isn't of a amillennial point of view. My purpose in this video is to explain why I became unconvinced, I don't even know if that's a word, of dispensationalism, of futurism, and really became convinced of partial preterism. But that historical note that dispensationalism is a new view really helped me feel more comfortable moving away from that position. And so, again, just kind of wrap things up here. Wanted to make this video in case you're like me and you've struggled with that interpretation of those texts and you struggle with some of that fruit, some of those abuses that have come from dispensationalism, whether it's kind of a newspaper theology where it's looking at world events and trying to connect the dots between the Bible and what's going on Fox News, or other different kinds of abuses of that viewpoint. If you struggle with that and you're like, man, is there another way to think about this topic? Yes, there is. Consider partial preterism. Consider amillennialism. There's great historical reason to hold to these viewpoints, and there's really strong textual reason from the Bible to hold to this understanding of the end times. So that's all I've got. Again, I'm not trying to be antagonistic to futurist dispensationalists in this video. I'm just trying to explain, here's why I switched, here's why I changed my view, and maybe help somebody who's in the same boat, who is struggling, who's questioning. Hopefully this will be kind of a lifeline to you of oh, there is another way to think about this that does remain faithful to the text, that is historically rooted. So if this is helpful, like the video, please, and give me a subscribe. I'm new to this, trying to figure it all out, and excited for what I'll be able to do in the future on the channel. I've got lots of different video ideas. Really, the struggle is time. I'm hoping to at least get one video out a month. That's my goal just as we get started. I'm in full-time ministry. I'm a pastor in New York, and so my priority is always going to be my flock, always going to be preaching and caring for those God has entrusted to me. And so, these videos will be on the back burner to that, but I do want it to be a priority. I do want to be making videos and making content because I think doing ministry online is important. It would almost be foolish today not to be doing ministry online to some degree, because there's just so much reach that can be had for the gospel and for sound doctrine. So thanks for watching. Have a good day.